Inside a warm house today, dinner is simple. Turn a knob, boil water, heat rises on its own. But out on the old Great Plains, nights worked differently. When firewood ran low, the home went quiet. The fire burned soft, barely more than a glow. Cold pressed in from every side. And on nights like that, most of us would panic. Because without fire, what could you even eat? For the native families of the plains, that moment wasn't fear. It was preparation. Days, weeks, sometimes months before the storm came. They dried, they stored, they saved. Every strip of meat, every nut, every root was a promise they made to themselves for nights when the fire couldn't burn. Tonight, you'll see exactly what they ate when the woodpile was almost gone. Out on those winter nights, the wind did not rush. It waited. The fire stayed low, just a soft glow on the frozen ground. When the last pieces of wood were too precious to burn, no one lifted the pot. There was no boiling, no steam. And without heat, the body cooled fast. Most people today would panic. But for native families, this moment was not fear. This was routine. They had planned for nights when the fire sleeps. They kept food that needed no flame. Dried meat hung from the rafters, stiff from the cold air. Nuts and seeds rested in small winter stores, packed tight in leather pouches. Food you could hold in your hand and eat right away. Quiet food, steady food. It was simple. When the fire could not cook, the food had to carry the warmth. Salted meat, dried berries, a handful of crushed seeds. Not pretty, not fancy, but survival never cared about pretty. Some of these foods could last months without spoiling. Most of us today have never tasted anything like it. But out there, it meant another day alive, another night warm enough to wait for the sun. This was their fireless meal, their small answer to the deep night. The fire did not keep them alive, preparation did. But that was only the beginning. There was one food that carried more warmth than all the rest combined. A food built for storms, hunger, and nights when no one could spare a single stick of wood. That food was pemmican. Winter on the plains was long enough that the animals vanished and the woodpile shrank faster than anyone liked. Some nights the fire was nothing but a low glow on the frozen ground. On nights like that, you could not cook. And without cooking, you lost more than comfort. You lost warmth. Protein kept the body steady. Without it, the cold moved in fast. So the people worked with the cold, not against it. They made a food built for deep nights. Pemmican. A simple mix of dried meat, melted fat, and crushed berries. Most folks today have never tasted anything like it. But out there, it was the difference between shivering and surviving. The process was quiet. Meat sliced thin laid in the wind, or smoked just enough to drive out the moisture. Then the dried strips were pounded by hand, turned into soft flakes, mixed with warm fat, and pressed into leather bags. A winter store you could hold in one hand. No fire, no pot, just food you could eat right away. Food heavy enough to keep the body warm from the inside. It was not pretty. It was not meant to be. Survival food rarely is. But pemmican carried more energy than any meal they could cook on a low fire. It was in its own way a stored fire, a flame you could eat when the wood was gone. And this was only one part of their plan. The next foods did not come from animals at all. They came from the ground, the trees, and the quiet patience of summer. When the fire dropped too low to boil anything, the cold worked fast. Without hot food, the body lost heat quicker than most people today realize. Protein helped you stand steady, but without carbs, you faded. And in a deep winter night, fading was dangerous. So native families turned to what they could eat raw. Nuts, seeds, berries dried from the warm months, quiet foods, patient foods, food that waited the same way the wind waited outside. Hazelnuts were cracked open long before the snow came. Sunflower seeds were dried and stored in small winter bags. Chokecherries, dark and sharp, were crushed into soft flakes. Then everything was ground together, mixed with a touch of warm fat, and shaped into dense cakes you could carry in your hand. These cakes were heavy. Heavy in the way winter food needs to be. Carbs for quick warmth, fat for long warmth. A small bite could keep someone going through hours of cold. Most folks today have never tasted anything like it, but out there, it was better than any hot soup they could have cooked on a dying fire. This was their answer to the nights when nothing could be boiled, when the pot stayed empty, but the stomach still needed strength. If you could not cook, you ate what the land had given you during warmer days. It was simple, it was real, and it worked. But this wasn't the end of their winter stores. Some of the most important food was still hidden underground, waiting in the frozen soil. When winter settled deep into the ground, the soil turned hard as stone, the cold pressed down. You could strike the dirt with a stick and hear it ring. Nothing easy grows in that kind of world. On nights when the fire was too weak to soften anything, there was no way to boil roots. Most of them would stay tough fibers locked tight from months of frost. Without carbs and minerals, the body slowed. And slowing in winter was a bad road to walk. So families leaned on the roots they had collected long before the snow came. Bitterroot, prairie turnip, cattail roots from the edges of frozen wetlands. Some could be eaten raw, some could be warmed just enough by holding them near a low fire. Not cooked, just coaxed, the same way you warm your hands instead of burning them. These roots were stored in shallow pits lined with grass and earth. Root caches, simple, silent, waiting under a skin of frost until someone needed them. You could pull one out in the dark and feel the cold cling to your fingers, but once eaten, they gave slow, steady warmth. Fiber to keep the stomach working, carbs to keep the legs moving, minerals to keep the body from falling behind. It wasn't fancy food. It wasn't meant to be. It was the quiet fuel of winter. A reminder that some warmth doesn't come from fire, but from the ground beneath your feet. And these roots were only one piece of the puzzle. The real winter strategy was bigger, a plan that held an entire family through the deep night. When the fire stayed small and the cold pushed hard against the walls, there were nights when cooking simply wasn't an option. The flame was too weak, the air too heavy, and every stick of wood felt like the last one. On nights like that, the family needed food that could wait. Food that didn't spoil, food the cold couldn't kill, so they turned to the ground, to the oldest storage method they knew, hidden food caches, buried beneath snow and frozen earth. It began long before winter. A pit was dug 2 or 3 feet deep, grass laid on the bottom, then strips of dried meat, handfuls of berries, bundles of roots gathered from warm days, all packed tight under bark hide or woven mats. After that, the pit was sealed, earth on top, snow on top of that, a natural shell of insulation, silent, still, cold enough to keep the food safe, but warm enough to keep it from freezing solid. Animals couldn't smell it, wind couldn't reach it. Time moved around it, but didn't touch it. On the hardest nights, you could dig through the crust of snow, push aside the cold soil, reach down, and pull out food that tasted like another season. Food from a time when the sun was higher and the hands weren't shaking from frost. It was simple math. If the fire couldn't feed you, the earth could. The ground was their quiet friend, a friend that held the winter stores until the family needed them most. And from these hidden caches came the next challenge of winter survival, how to share the food so that everyone made it to morning. There were nights when the wind didn't just blow, it pressed in. You could hear it waiting outside the teepee, pushing cold through every stitch of hide. On nights like that, the fire had to stay small. Sometimes it went out completely. And when the fire slept, the family had to eat differently. You couldn't fill your stomach the way you would on a warm day. Eating too much meant your body needed more heat to digest it, more heat than you had to spare. So the old people followed a quiet rule, the rule of warmth. Eat little but eat strong. The adults took pemmican dense heavy built for long nights. A bite was enough to keep the body steady. It worked slow the way winter food should. You didn't rush warmth out there. The children were given nuts and berries, quick energy soft on the stomach. Carbs that hit fast enough to keep their hands warm enough to keep fear away. The elders ate roots warmed near a low flame or by hand. Easy to chew, easy to digest. No shock of cold in the gut. Just slow, steady fuel for people whose bodies had already fought many winters. It wasn't random. It wasn't kindness alone. It was survival math. A plan made around a dying fire. Most folks today have never had to think this way. But out there, knowing who ate what and how much kept a family from freezing before the sun came back. Food was not just food. It was strategy. A way of sharing warmth when the fire could no longer do its job. And that strategy leads us to something deeper, a way of thinking that guided every winter decision they made. When the flame dropped to almost nothing, the whole teepee turned the color of a dying ember, soft orange, barely alive. You could hear the cold settling in the way frost settles on the edges of a creek. On nights like that, the body still needed heat, but there was no wood left to burn. No crackle, no sparks climbing into the dark, just quiet breathing and the steady cold waiting outside. So the people did something simple, or something most folks today never think about. They used food the way we use fire. Fat burned slow inside the body, a long steady flame you couldn't see but could feel in your chest and hands. Protein and carbs didn't warm you fast, but they kept the warmth you already had from slipping away. A bite of pemmican was like lighting a small fire under your ribs. A handful of nuts or berries gave just enough heat to keep fingers from going stiff. A piece of winter root calmed the stomach, kept the body from sending its last warmth to fight cold digestion. Most people today think warmth only comes from the outside, but on the plains they learned the truth early. Warmth begins inside. Warmth is carried, stored, protected. They didn't need a roaring fire to stay alive. They didn't even need a bright one. They ate their fire. They carried it in the food. They saved the food that waited through storms and long nights. This wasn't luck. This was wisdom. A quiet kind of knowing built from winters that tested everyone. And from here, we step into the final reflection of why they endured when so many others would have frozen. When you look at nights like these with the fire low and the cold pressing in, it's easy to think survival came from strength, but it didn't. It came from preparation. They worked in the warm months for the nights when the fire couldn't help them. Every strip of dried meat, every handful of nuts, every root pulled from frozen ground light to carry simple to store but heavy in value. Most people today pack things that shine. They carried things that saved. Things that weighed almost nothing yet kept a family warm through the longest storms. And the truth is simple. They didn't fight winter. They didn't try to outrun it. They learned its rhythm. They moved with it. They understood that warmth doesn't begin with fire. It begins long before the first snow falls. That's the part we forget. Survival isn't built in the moment you need it. It's built in the quiet seasons, in the steady work no one sees, in the choices made when the sun is still high. And that quiet wisdom, the kind you can't hold in your hand, is what carried them through nights when almost nothing else could. Inside the teepee, the fire drops low. Its glow rises and falls with every breath. The walls turn quiet. The cold waits just outside, but they are not hungry. Not tonight, because the real fire isn't in the pit. It's in the food they prepared months earlier. Dried meat, nuts, roots, all of it turning into slow, steady warmth inside their bodies. The flame may sleep, but they don't fear the dark. They worked with the cold long before winter ever came. Stay by the fire.